Something just shifted inside the Cleveland Browns, and it's the kind of shift you don't immediately see in headlines but can feel in everything surrounding the team. It's in the way conversations are being framed, in the subtle changes in tone from people who are usually careful with every word, and in how quickly the narrative has started to move. What was once being sold as a wide-open quarterback competition suddenly feels like something much more controlled, much more calculated. Because when an organization is truly undecided, you hear uncertainty. Right now, you're not hearing uncertainty, you're hearing direction, even if no one has officially admitted it yet. For months, the Browns managed to keep the situation balanced on the surface. They leaned on neutral language, repeated phrases like open competition, and allowed the media to debate possibilities without ever stepping in to clarify the truth. On one side, there's Deshaun Watson, the quarterback tied to one of the biggest financial commitments in league history, a player the franchise once believed would define its future. On the other side, there's Shedeur Sanders, a younger, cheaper, and increasingly intriguing option who wasn't expected to take control of this story so quickly, but has steadily forced his way into the center of it. And now, instead of the Browns controlling the narrative is starting to reveal them. Because when the most connected voices around a team begin to lean in one direction, it's rarely accidental. These aren't random opinions or guesses thrown into the air for attention. They are shaped by conversations behind closed doors, by observations made when cameras aren't rolling, and by a growing understanding of how people inside the building actually feel. And recently, those signals have started pointing very clearly toward one outcome. Not definitively stated, not officially confirmed, but strongly suggested in a way that's impossible to ignore if you're paying attention. What makes this even more fascinating is how carefully it's all being handled. No bold declarations, no dramatic announcements, just a slow, deliberate shift in language, as if the organization is preparing the world for something before it actually happens. It's the kind of transition that doesn't arrive all at once, it builds quietly, piece by piece, until suddenly it feels inevitable. And that's exactly where things are heading right now. Because once you start connecting everything, the insider comments, the coaching tone, the roster decisions, you begin to see a completely different picture forming. This isn't just a quarterback battle anymore. It's a turning point for the entire franchise. And the deeper you look into it, the clearer it becomes that this story may already be decided, even if nobody has officially said it yet. It didn't come from a breaking news alert or a dramatic TV segment. It came quietly, almost casually, in the middle of a conversation, and that's exactly why it matters. When Mary Kay Cabot spoke about the Browns' quarterback situation, she didn't make a bold prediction or try to create headlines. She simply said that her gut feeling was that Shedeur Sanders would have the edge going into the 2026 season. On the surface, that might sound like a soft, non-committal statement, but coming from someone that spent decades inside that organization, that kind of language carries weight far beyond what it seems. Because here's what people often miss. Insiders like Cabot don't operate on random instincts. A gut feeling at that level is usually the result of dozens of small signals adding up over time. It's built from conversations with coaches, front office personnel, and players. It's shaped by how people answer questions when they think no one is reading too deeply into their words. It's influenced by tone, hesitation, confidence, and even what isn't being said. So when someone that connected starts leaning in one direction publicly, it's rarely just a guess, it's a reflection of something already developing behind the scenes. And what makes this moment even more telling is the timing. This wasn't said months ago when everything was still uncertain. This came after a full season of evaluation, after coaching changes, and after the organization had time to step back and reassess everything. For Cabot to come out now and suggest that Sanders has the edge means the internal conversation in Cleveland is no longer balanced. It's moving. Slowly, maybe even quietly, but definitely moving. There's also the subtle shift in how the situation is being framed. Earlier in the offseason, the discussion revolved around possibilities, different quarterbacks being mentioned, different paths being explored, but now the language is narrowing. Instead of asking who could be the starter, the conversation is starting to center around whether anyone can realistically stop Sanders from becoming that guy. That's a completely different kind of discussion, and it signals a deeper level of confidence building inside the organization. And maybe the most revealing part of all this is how carefully it's all being handled. No bold declarations, no dramatic announcements, just a slow, deliberate shift in language, as if the organization is preparing the world for something before it actually happens. It's the kind of transition that doesn't arrive all at once. It builds quietly, piece by piece, until suddenly it feels inevitable. And that's exactly where things are heading right now. Because once you start connecting everything, the insider comments, the coaching tone, the roster decisions, you begin to see a completely different picture forming. This isn't just a quarterback battle anymore. It's a turning point for the entire franchise. And the deeper you look into it, the clearer it becomes that this story may already be decided, even if nobody has officially said it yet. It didn't come from a breaking news alert or a dramatic TV segment. It came quietly, almost casually, in the middle of a conversation, and that's exactly why it matters. When Mary Kay Cabot spoke about the Browns' quarterback situation, she didn't make a bold prediction or try to create headlines. She simply said that her gut feeling was that Shedeur Sanders would have the edge going into the 2026 season. On the surface, that might sound like a soft, non-committal statement, but coming from someone that spent decades inside that organization, that kind of language carries weight far beyond what it seems. Because here's what people often miss. Insiders like Cabot don't operate on random instincts. A gut feeling at that level is usually the result of dozens of small signals adding up over time. It's built from conversations with coaches, front office personnel, and players. It's shaped by how people answer questions when they think no one is reading too deeply into their words. It's influenced by tone, hesitation, confidence, and even what isn't being said. So when someone that connected starts leaning in one direction publicly, it's rarely just a guess. It's a reflection of something already developing behind the scenes. And what makes this moment even more telling is the timing. This wasn't said months ago when everything was still uncertain. This came after a full season of evaluation, after coaching changes, and after the organization had time to step back and reassess everything. For Cabot to come out now and suggest that Sanders has the edge means the internal conversation in Cleveland is no longer balanced. It's moving, slowly, maybe even quietly, but definitely moving. There's also the subtle shift in how the situation is being framed. Earlier in the offseason, the discussion revolved around possibilities, different quarterbacks being mentioned, different paths being explored, but now the language is narrowing. Instead of asking who could be the starter, the conversation is starting to center around whether anyone can realistically stop Sanders from becoming that guy. That's a completely different kind of discussion, and it signals a deeper level of confidence building inside the organization. And maybe the most revealing part of all this is how carefully it's all being handled. No bold declarations, no dramatic announcements, just a slow, deliberate shift in language, as if the organization is preparing the world for something before it actually happens. It's the kind of transition that doesn't arrive all at once. It builds quietly, piece by piece, until suddenly it feels inevitable. And that's exactly where things are heading right now. Because once you start connecting everything, the insider comments, the coaching tone, the roster decisions, you begin to see a completely different picture forming. This isn't just a quarterback battle anymore. It's a turning point for the entire franchise. And the deeper you look into it, the clearer it becomes that this story may already be decided, even if nobody has officially said it yet. It didn't come from a breaking news alert or a dramatic TV segment. It came quietly, almost casually, in the middle of a conversation, and that's exactly why it matters. When Mary Kay Cabot spoke about the Browns' quarterback situation, she didn't make a bold prediction or try to create headlines. She simply said that her gut feeling was that Shedeur Sanders would have the edge going into the 2026 season. On the surface, that might sound like a soft, non-committal statement, but coming from someone that spent decades inside that organization, that kind of language carries weight far beyond what it seems. Because here's what people often miss. Insiders like Cabot don't operate on random instincts. A gut feeling at that level is usually the result of dozens of small signals adding up over time. It's built from conversations with coaches, front office personnel, and players. It's shaped by how people answer questions when they think no one is reading too deeply into their words. It's influenced by tone, hesitation, confidence, and even what isn't being said. So when someone that connected starts leaning in one direction publicly, it's rarely just a guess. It's a reflection of something already developing behind the scenes. And what makes this moment even more telling is the timing. This wasn't said months ago when everything was still uncertain. This came after a full season of evaluation, after coaching changes, and after the organization had time to step back and reassess everything. For Cabot to come out now and suggest that Sanders has the edge means the internal conversation in Cleveland is no longer balanced. It's moving, slowly, maybe even quietly, but definitely moving. There's also the subtle shift in how the situation is being framed. Earlier in the offseason, the discussion revolved around possibilities, different quarterbacks being mentioned, different paths being explored, but now
And just when it seemed like that was the clearest signal we were going to get, the new head coach stepped up to the podium and said something that revealed even more than he probably intended. When Todd Monken stepped up at the combine and called the quarterback situation an open competition, it sounded exactly like what you'd expect from a first-year head coach. Balanced, careful, neutral, the kind of answer designed to avoid headlines rather than create them. And on the surface, it did exactly that. Most people heard it and walked away thinking the Browns truly hadn't made up their minds yet. But if you slow down and actually listen to what he said, and more importantly, how he said it, the message underneath starts to look very different. Because Monken didn't just say the competition was open, he followed it up by explaining that there wasn't enough on film over the past couple of years to clearly declare a starter. And that's where things get interesting. When a coach says something like that, you have to ask, whose film is he really talking about? Technically, it applies to both Deshaun Watson and Shedeur Sanders, but context matters. Watson's body of work in Cleveland has been limited, inconsistent, and interrupted. Sanders, on the other hand, is coming off a small but revealing sample size as a young quarterback in a difficult situation. So when Monken says there isn't enough to crown a starter, it doesn't level the playing field. It actually opens the door wider for the younger option. And then came the part that didn't sound neutral at all. In that same setting, Monken went out of his way to describe Sanders as having elite playmaking ability. That's not standard coach speak. Coaches don't casually throw around the word elite, especially talking about a second-year player who hasn't even secured the starting job yet. That word carries weight. It reflects belief, projection, and a level of excitement that you usually only hear when a coach sees something special developing. And the way he said it, confident, almost matter-of-fact, made it clear that this wasn't just potential in theory, it was something he genuinely sees on tape. That contrast is where the hidden message really lives. On one side, you have carefully measured language about an open competition. On the other, you have specific, glowing praise directed at one player. Coaches are trained to control narratives, especially in situations like this. They don't reveal their hand early, but they do leave clues. And Monken's clues aren't subtle if you line them up. Neutral framing for the situation as a whole, and targeted excitement when it comes to Sanders. Even the tone gives it away. When Monken talks about the competition, he sounds professional. When he talks about Sanders, he sounds energized. There's a difference there that it's hard to fake. It suggests that while the competition technically exists, his personal evaluation is already leaning in a very specific direction. Not officially decided, not publicly declared, but clearly forming. And just when it seemed like that was enough to understand where things were heading, his film study revealed something that pushed this even further. What really changed the tone inside the building wasn't just potential or projection, it was the film. When Todd Monken and his staff sat down and broke down every snap from Shedeur Sanders' rookie stretch, they weren't expecting perfection. They knew the situation he stepped into was far from ideal. But what they found on tape wasn't just a young quarterback surviving chaos, it was a player creating something out of it. And that's the part that caught people off guard. because the raw numbers only tell a fraction of the story. On paper, Sanders' rookie sample looks modest: limited starts, pressure on nearly every drop back, and an offense that never fully stabilized around him. But when you actually watch the film, a different picture starts to emerge. You see a quarterback dealing with constant breakdowns in protection, collapsing pockets, and defensive pressure that arrives before plays even have a chance to develop. And instead of folding, you see him adjusting, sliding in the pocket, buying time, keeping his eyes downfield, and finding ways to extend plays that should have been dead on arrival. That's where Monken's reaction becomes so telling. He admitted that Sanders' mobility and feel under pressure surprised him, not just impressed him, surprised him. And that distinction matters. Coaches expect certain traits when they evaluate a player, especially one with Sanders' background. But to still be caught off guard after studying every rep, that means the tape revealed something deeper than expected. It showed instincts, it showed composure, it showed a level of awareness that you can't easily teach. And it wasn't just about escaping pressure, it was about what happened after. Sanders wasn't just running to survive, he was creating opportunities, turning broken plays into positive gains, resetting his feet and delivering throws after chaos, keeping drives alive in situations where most young quarterbacks would take a sack or force a mistake. That kind of playmaking doesn't always show up in highlight reels, but coaches notice it immediately because it translates directly to winning football. Now put that in context. This is a rookie operating behind one of the most unstable offensive lines in the league, dealing with constant pressure, limited preparation time, and a system that wasn't fully built around his strengths. And even in that environment, he managed to show traits that made an experienced offensive mind step back and reconsider what he thought he knew. That's not normal development, that's a signal. Because if that's what Sanders looked like in a broken situation, the obvious question becomes, what happens when the situation isn't broken anymore? What happens when the protection improves, when the system is tailored to him, when he gets a full offseason of preparation as a focal point instead of an afterthought? That's the projection the coaching staff is starting to make, and it's a projection that changes everything. And while that realization is building momentum for Sanders, it also shines a much harsher light on the other side of this quarterback room. And that brings everything back to the part of this story the organization can't fully escape, because no matter how much momentum is building around Sanders, the reality of Deshaun Watson is still sitting right there in the middle of it, not just as another quarterback in the room, but as one of the biggest financial and strategic commitments the franchise has ever made. This isn't a normal situation where a veteran is simply being outplayed. This is a situation where the past and the future are colliding at the most important position on the field. Because when you strip everything down, the issue isn't just performance, it's consistency, availability, and trajectory. Since arriving in Cleveland, Watson hasn't been able to establish any real rhythm. Injuries have interrupted his seasons, momentum has been difficult to build, and the version of him that once dominated in Houston has only appeared in flashes, if at all. And in the NFL, especially at quarterback, flashes aren't enough. Teams need stability, they need progression, they need something they can rely on week after week, and that's the part that has been missing. Then there's the physical reality, which is impossible to ignore even if no one wants to say it too directly. Multiple lower body injuries, long stretches away from the field, and the challenge of returning to peak form at this stage of his career all adds layers of uncertainty. Not speculation, not exaggeration, just uncertainty. And when you compare that to a younger quarterback trending upward, getting healthier, and gaining experience, the contrast becomes hard to overlook. But the biggest weight in this entire situation might be the contract. Watson's deal isn't just large, it's restrictive. It limits flexibility, it raises expectations, and it makes every decision around him more complicated. The Browns can't simply move on without consequences, which means he's going to be part of the equation whether they want him to be or not. And that's where things get uncomfortable, because being part of the equation doesn't guarantee being the answer. What makes this even more complicated is how carefully the conversation has to be handled publicly. You won't hear the organization openly question him. You won't hear direct criticism. That's not how these situations are managed. Instead, you hear neutral language, supportive statements, and reminders that he's still in the mix. But underneath that, the direction of the team tells a different story. Because while the words remain cautious, the actions are starting to lean elsewhere. And that's the key difference. This isn't about pushing Watson out. It's about the team quietly preparing for a scenario where they no longer depend on him. It's a subtle shift, but a powerful one. Because once an organization starts building with someone else in mind, the clock on the previous plan has already started ticking. But despite all of this, there's still a narrative floating around that Watson could somehow reclaim control of this situation, and that narrative didn't come from nowhere. That narrative didn't just appear out of thin air, it was fueled by a single comment that quickly took on a life of its own. When Adam Schefter mentioned that there are people who believe Deshaun Watson could still end up starting on opening day, parts of the media world treated it like a major shift in the story. Suddenly, the conversation flipped. Instead of focusing on momentum building around Shedeur Sanders, the spotlight briefly swung back to Watson, as if the entire situation had reset overnight. But if you slow down and actually examine what was said, it tells a very different story. Schefter didn't report that the Browns were planning to start Watson. He didn't say the coaching staff preferred him. He didn't even suggest that the competition was leaning his way. He said there are people who believe it could happen. That's not confirmation, that's speculation. And in the NFL media cycle, speculation can spread fast, especially when it involves a high-profile name and a massive contract. But speculation doesn't always reflect reality inside the building. Because the real driver behind that idea isn't performance, it's finances. Watson is owed a massive guaranteed salary, and that alone ensures he remains part of the conversation. The Browns can't simply ignore that kind of investment. They have to justify it, at least publicly. They have to give the appearance of a legitimate competition. And from the outside, that can look like a genuine battle for the starting job, but internally, those are two completely different things. This is where the gap between narrative and reality becomes clear. The narrative says Watson could start because he's still on the roster and being paid like a starter. The reality says he's still on the roster because the contract demands it, not because the team is building around him. Those are not the same motivations. One is about optics and financial structure. The other is about long-term direction. And right now, all signs point to the Browns prioritizing the future over the past. You can even see it in how the conversation is framed by different voices. National media tends to focus on possibilities, what could happen, what might happen, what someone somewhere believes might happen. But local insiders, the ones closest to the organization, are starting to lean much more clearly in one direction. And when those two perspectives don't match, it usually means the broader narrative is lagging behind what's actually developing behind the scenes. So yes, technically, Watson being the starter is still a possibility. No one can rule it out completely at this stage, but possibility doesn't equal probability. And when you weigh everything, the insider signals, the coaching tone, the roster decisions, it becomes harder and harder to see that scenario as anything more than a fallback, not the plan. And once you understand that, the next piece of this puzzle becomes impossible to ignore, because the Browns aren't just talking about the future, they're actively building it around one specific player. The clearest sign of where this is all heading isn't coming from interviews or insider comments, it's coming from the moves the Browns are making. Because when a team starts reshaping its roster in a very specific way, that usually tells you more than any press conference ever could. And right now, everything about this offseason points to one conclusion: the infrastructure is being built with Shedeur Sanders in mind. Start with the offensive line, because that was the biggest problem last season, and everyone inside the building knows it. Instead of minor adjustments, the Browns went for a full overhaul, bringing in experienced, proven players to stabilize protection and eliminate the chaos that defined the offense. That kind of aggressive rebuild isn't just about improving the team in general, it's about protecting an investment.
And when you look at the timing, it lines up perfectly with giving a young quarterback the environment he needs to actually develop. This isn't a patch job. This is a foundation being rebuilt from the ground up. Then look at what's happening around that line. There's a clear effort to upgrade the weapons, to add more reliable targets, and to create an offense that can actually function consistently. Reports and discussions around draft plans suggest the Browns are targeting playmakers who can grow alongside their quarterback, not just plug short-term gaps. That's a long-term approach. That's how teams operate when they believe they have found their guy and want to maximize his window early, especially while he's still on a rookie deal. And that's the part that ties everything together. Building around a rookie contract quarterback gives a team flexibility, financial freedom to strengthen multiple areas at once, to create depth, and to avoid being locked into difficult decisions. It's the exact opposite of what happens when you're tied to a massive veteran contract. So when the Browns start investing heavily in protection, in development, and in offensive structure, it's not random, it's strategic, it's aligned with a specific timeline, and that timeline fits Shedeur Sanders far more than it fits Deshaun Watson.
And maybe the most telling part of all this is that none of these moves feel temporary. This doesn't look like a team hedging its bets or preparing for multiple outcomes. It looks like a team choosing a direction and committing to it, even if they haven't officially announced that choice yet. Because once you start building like this, you're not just preparing for a competition, you're preparing for a transition. And at this point, with everything moving in the same direction, there's one final piece of the story that makes it impossible to ignore where this is heading. At this point, it's no longer about trying to predict what might happen. It's about recognizing what's already in motion. Because when you step back and look at everything together, the insider comments, the coaching tone, the roster decisions, and the way the conversation is quietly shifted, it stops looking like a true competition and starts looking like a transition that's already underway. Not officially announced, not publicly confirmed, but clearly taking shape behind the scenes. And the word that keeps coming up around this situation is simple, but incredibly revealing: trending. When Mary Kay Cabot said the situation feels like it's trending toward Shedeur Sanders, that wasn't just casual phrasing. Trending means movement. It means the internal conversation isn't stuck and neutral, it's shifting in a specific direction over time. Decisions inside NFL organizations don't usually flip overnight. They evolve. They build gradually through evaluations, meetings, film sessions, and internal discussions. And by the time that momentum becomes visible externally, it's often because the groundwork has already been laid. What makes this even more telling is how consistent the signals have become. It's not just one comment or one moment anymore, it's a pattern. The insider leans one way, the head coach's tone leans the same way, the roster moves align with that direction. Even the way the future is being discussed feels centered around Sanders rather than anyone else. When multiple independent pieces all point to the same outcome, it stops being coincidence, it becomes alignment. And yet, publicly, the Browns still have to maintain the appearance of balance. That's part of the process. You don't declare a starting quarterback in February. You don't shut the door on a veteran under contract. You let the competition play out in front of everyone. But that doesn't mean the organization is walking into it without expectations. There's a difference between allowing a competition to happen and genuinely not knowing how it will end. Right now, it feels much closer to the first scenario than the second. Because internally, this is likely being framed less as who will win and more as can Sanders take it. That's a completely different mindset. One is open-ended, the other assumes a direction and waits for confirmation. And everything we've seen suggests the Browns are waiting for Sanders to validate what they're already starting to believe. So yes, the reps haven't been taken yet, training camp hasn't started, no official depth chart has been released, but the direction? That's already forming, quietly, steadily, and in a way that's becoming harder to deny with each passing week. And when you reach that point, when the outcome starts to feel inevitable even before it's announced, it leads to one unavoidable conclusion. At a certain point, you have to stop pretending this is still a mystery, because when every signal, internal and external, starts pointing in the same direction, the only thing left unclear is why no one has said it outright yet. The truth is, the Cleveland Browns are already moving toward Shedeur Sanders as their future at quarterback, not as a possibility, not as one option among many, but as the direction the organization is preparing to commit to once the timing makes it official. And the reason it hasn't been said out loud is simple. It's complicated. You don't just move on cleanly from a situation involving Deshaun Watson. There are financial realities, public expectations, and layers of decisions tied to that contract that can't be undone overnight. So instead of a sudden announcement, what you're seeing is a gradual shift, a transition that happens step by step, where actions start to speak louder than words long before the words ever come. Because if this were truly a balanced competition, the signals would feel balanced too. They don't. The excitement, the planning, the roster construction, it's all leaning one way. That doesn't guarantee the outcome, and nothing in the NFL ever does, but it does tell you where the belief inside the building is starting to settle, and belief is where these decisions begin. What makes this moment so important is that it's bigger than just one position battle. This is about the identity of the franchise going forward. It's about whether the Browns double down on the past or fully embrace a new direction built around youth, flexibility, and development. And right now, everything suggests they're ready to take that step, even if they're doing it quietly. So when the season approaches and the depth chart finally becomes official, it shouldn't feel like a surprise. It should feel like the confirmation of something that's been building for months. Because sometimes the most important decisions aren't the ones announced with headlines. They're the ones revealed slowly through patterns, signals, and shifts that only make sense when you connect them all together. And now the real question isn't who's going to start, it's whether everyone else is ready to accept what the Browns have already started to become.